Hi, welcome to episode 2, where today we're going to talk about the subject of sky gazing, or gazing up into the sky in hopes that something might come. But a couple of backdrop points for understanding Scripture. The first is the writers of Scripture used all different kinds of tools of language to convey a deep truth. And one of them is they often use metaphors. But then they also use numbers and colors to indicate more than simply that number or that color. As my favorite biblical scholar says it this way, John Dominic Crossan. My point, once again, is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we are now smart enough to take them symbolically, but that they told them symbolically and we are now dumb enough to take them literally. So with that as a backdrop, let's get into today's scripture. Today's scripture has to do with the ascension because, well, the ascension of Jesus from the earthly realm into the heavenly realm happens this week. In fact, it happens on Thursday. Why on a Thursday? Well, it's 40 days after Easter. And that's when biblical scholars and the church interprets Jesus was with his disciples 40 days after he rose before he ascended into heaven. But remember, I told you numbers mean something significant. Well, the number 40 means look out, life is changing forever. So if you go to Scripture, every time you see 40, 40, 40, 40, it doesn't mean more than 39. It means watch out, life is changing forever. So in today's passage, we have a couple paragraphs from the book of Acts describing the disciples gathered around Jesus and him ascending to heaven. What I wanted to focus on is this curious passage right near the end. While they were gazing into heaven as he went, behold, two men stood beside them in white robes and said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? Jesus is gone. Well, the reason they stood there gazing into heaven and hoping beyond hope that this was a quirk and he was just going to turn around and show up again is because they were scared. They were overwhelmed by the circumstances of the time. They thought they had lost Jesus, and then Jesus rose and they got him back, and now he was gone. And what could they possibly do? And so they stared into the sky, hoping that he would come back and show them the way. Now, he had spent 40 days preparing them for this moment, but it was still too shocking for them. Why do you stand there staring at the sky? And so what they did is they left the mount and they went back to the upper room because they couldn't think of anything else to do until Pentecost. And that's next week. We'll talk about that next week. How does that apply to now? Well, right now, we are in a whole host of crises. Everywhere we look, there are crises. There's crises of violence and environmental and health. And there's wealth disparity and racial violence and racial disparity and xenophobia and immigration and political systems. It's enough to frighten all of us. And then you put the pandemic crisis on top of it, and it is really an odd time to be alive. And no wonder some of us are staring at the sky, hoping beyond hope that Jesus will come and lead us out of this, or that some Messiah will come and lead us out of this. And what should we do? What should we do? Well, first of all, my experience is that angels aren't the cherubs or the mighty warriors that we sometimes draw in our Bible stories. Angels is another word for messengers, messengers from God. Right? And I found in my life experiences that these messengers from God look like everyday ordinary people. In fact, they are everyday ordinary people, and God is using them to convey to us a truth that we need to hear, and we won't hear it until somebody speaks it directly to us. In fact, most often, the people who are speaking God's truth to us don't realize that they are God's messenger at that point. And so facing all these crises, what should we do? Well, we should go to our communities, whether we're doing that on a virtual basis because we're in isolation or some other communication. We should listen to our better angels. We should decide a path forward, and whether one of these crises calls you particularly to get involved in it, that's up to you and your better angels to decide. But I do know one thing. If any or all of these crises concern you, the number one thing that we all have to do when we decide that we're no longer just going to stare at the sky, but we're going to act, the number one thing we need to do is to vote. People have paid a tremendous price to give us the right to vote. And if we want to change any of these crises, it begins with taking the initiative to vote. I don't say that simply. I realize that voting is not going to be a matter of convenience or comfort. In fact, it might even be risky, depending on if your voting place is exposing you to a disease, or your voting place is exposing you to harassment because people are trying to keep you from voting. But vote we must. So instead of staring at the sky, listen to your better angels and take action. So that's it for this week. Next week, I invite you to return to us, and we will once again spend a moment or two at this curious intersection of ancient scripture and modern life, the wisdom of the old informing our way of the new. Take care.